Hello, welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of seconds. We're just waiting for the room to fill, so just feel free to hang tight. We'll get started shortly. And I'll keep repeating this message a couple of times. Hello, for those of you that are just joining us, we're going to get started in about 1 minute. We're just waiting for the room to fill. We'll get started shortly. Hello to those of you just joining us. We're going to get started in about a minute. Hang tight. We'll get started shortly. I'll keep repeating this message about a couple of times as we wait for the room to fill. We'll get started shortly. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. Hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity. So in my role, I get to engage with our supporters through events, volunteer opportunities, and things of that nature. So now I get to engage with you all here. Feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens as we go throughout the presentation, but we won't answer any of those until the end. And the webinar is being recorded and will be sent out afterwards via email to all of you. So if you miss something or you want to share it afterwards, you'll be able to rewatch it, and I'll be sharing the slides afterwards as well. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We're going to talk about key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved, and also how we can take action to address our most pressing economic issues. So why are we here? Well, TechEquity got started because some of its founders and early members saw symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of these problems they were noticing. And so they noticed things like rising rents, increases in displacement, increases in traffic, increases in people experiencing homelessness around them. And as they talked to others in their community, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns, but that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions to some of these issues that they were seeing around them. And especially now in the face of the pandemic that we've been having this last couple of years, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. But at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate some of this inequality that some of our founders were already seeing a couple of years ago. And so because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, so I've kind of been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them, for their jobs, for their homes, etc. But I also have friends and family who pursue jobs within tech, and they've have found lots of success for themselves and for their families alike. But we see that when tech shoulders the blame for some of these issues, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help, that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide. And while we're all unsure as to how we'll be managing this new normal that was caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that many within the tech sector remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech was able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage, especially in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area, and the fact that rents are rising, I don't think is really a surprise to anyone on this call because we all know this, we feel this, we're either personally experiencing it or we've been told by others who are experiencing it, such as friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants or renters have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing California stats because that's where we're based as an organization and it's where we're headquartered, but there's a version of this playing out all across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address this shared crisis, it's understandable as to why communities are frustrated, like we just talked about. And just to put it in context with the pandemic, before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering around 4%, and we were already struggling to make ends meet. Everyone was experiencing a bit of the affordability crisis. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims had spiked to 16%, which was a more dramatic spike than our last recession in 2008. So in the span of 1 month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. At TechEquity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it's not going to happen on its own, right? We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this. And the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today, and getting to know a little bit more about the history of these issues. And so our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in systems change in 3 major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we really do this in a variety of ways. We have book club discussions, panel discussions with experts in whatever topic we're talking about, webinars. We produce voter guides around election season. We also advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of that is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we helped in coalition with state leaders, on-the-ground community organizations, and people experiencing rising rent hikes themselves personally. And the Tenant Protection Act now extends protections to over 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through our corporate partnerships, programs, and engagements. And tech workers have this outsized political power that has largely been untapped to when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives, it builds more empathy and more ethical practices in our workplace, in the products, and in our surrounding communities. So our 2 key issue areas at TechEquity are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, and we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. And while the pandemic has exposed, like we talked about, the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making, and the policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our community is feeling now. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhood ratings to guide investment. And the policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed the riskiest. On maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image of the screen, that's a map of San Francisco with redlined neighborhoods, which are all those red blocks you see. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment or redline didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership, buying a home, or for something like maintenance of their home, for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. And the crisis we're living in is decades in the making, like we said, way before tech. And it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends across California and across the country. So these are examples of redline neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, which are two up and coming tech cities. So on the left side, we have Austin. On the right side, we have Atlanta. And once again, all those red blocks are historically redline neighborhoods within those cities. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock, like a global pandemic. That could be a huge rent increase, sudden loss of a job, or your car breaks down and you have a huge bill in order to repair it. And it impacts almost 1 out of 3 Californians. 33.9% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 41.2% of African American households in liquid asset poverty and 56.2% of Latino households living in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening. Many years of policy choices have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. And the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that aren't covering the cost of living, have created this regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic because many people in our communities were already struggling. And as pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades as well, even though productivity has dramatically increased. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019. That means that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. And it means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for better pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a gap between race. White men are earning more cents to the dollar, that's the orange bar on the left side of your screen, in comparison to Black men and women, the two blue bars on the right side of your screen. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to live in cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here was already high. So let's take a look at how a worker that's earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average two-bedroom working a regular, normal 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up this impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city. And this problem persists all across the country. So even though costs in up and coming tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as California and the San Francisco Bay Area, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone that's earning minimum wage within those cities. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, and bus drivers who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, but why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply, and this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build in order to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. And as housing costs have skyrocketed, the production of affordable housing is not being matched. The working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates while people with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, the orange bars on the left, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco, as they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's actually why that last blue bar on the bottom is actually increasing. There just isn't enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are more tragic. As we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. Furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years as well. A combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, a lack of affordable housing production have really created this crisis that has caused a lot of displacement. So displacement really is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. And the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And We can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. And the good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. But we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So what can we do? Well, at TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities a better place to live. And we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. And so here's what we've identified in the housing world, and we need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. So building more homes, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing lengthy delays and administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation, making sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from being displaced. So it's going to take a long time to build the necessary housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to make sure that existing renters are protected from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. So that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. And especially now, we have to be thinking about short and long-term solutions for preservation and protection, because like we've talked about, many of our neighbors are more at risk than ever. And we also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. And we have to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities that exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role. And we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see this large disparity emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contract workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there's fair scheduling. And we need to expand and equip the workforce. So training as a standalone approach is not going to lead us out of inequality, and it's not going to guarantee employment for most displaced workers. So in order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development for new and diverse talent. And at the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive, and we must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. Once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved in tech equity. We host a bunch of educational and social events. If you're interested in public policy, every year we have priority legislation bills, which I'll be talking about soon, with a variety of ways to help support those as they go through the legislative cycle. For corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So you can reply to that email I'll send out afterwards if you're interested. And so this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in and build community in the process. We do also have, I forgot to mention, Civic Tech projects. So if you have a skill set with engineering, front-end design, back-end engineering, UX design, really anything, any type of skill, We are looking for people to plug into projects we're currently working on if you have spare time every week. And so this year, our key initiatives really began with the Contract Worker Disparity Project, which was a first of its kind worker-centered initiative that helped shed a light on the practice of contracting out and proposed and advocated for public policy solutions and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We also have the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, which is examining the promises and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space don't reinforce the racial housing systems and policies of the past, like we talked about earlier. We're also, interested in passing economic justice policy. So every year we introduce a bold policy agenda to address economic inequality in the housing market and in the workplace. And our priority this year was around housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, affordable housing, data surveillance, and more. And like I said, each year we're championing new bills and new pieces of legislation and policy. And finally, we have the System Reset Initiative, which is helping companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration. And we're partnering with justice involved people and organizations to get system reset into every tech company in California. And so what can you do today? Like I said, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can sign up for a community conversation, which is a one-on-one with me where, you can talk via Zoom and, we can talk about your journey here at TechEquity, and you can ask a little bit more in depth on a personal level of like what we do and how you'd like to get involved. Or you can take action with us, like I said, by becoming that Civic Tech volunteer or supporting some of our upcoming priority legislation. So now I'll talk about one of those pieces of legislation. So this year, we really championed the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act. It was Senate Bill 1162, SB 1162. And, that would make pay equity reports public so that all workers have the information that they need to ensure that there's equal pay for equal work, and ensures that companies create a fair and equal playing field for all workers by posting the salaries in the job description and posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So SB 1162 was signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom, I think just last week. So this is just an example of some of the work that we do. And we had volunteers, call into committee meetings to testify, voice their statements of support, attend a rally in San Francisco, sign on to a petition online. And so there's really a variety of ways for you to plug in and support some of these cool things that we're doing in the next couple of years. And so on events, we host tons of events. So you can check out our events page for previous events. We have all the recordings on there from panel discussions, and we always have events coming up. So just keep an eye out on that page, and we'll post what we have coming up for November and December. So that's really it. That's as I mentioned, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. Tell a friend about our work, sign up for a one-on-one with me, or just hit me up and see, how you'd like to participate in any of our programming, and I can point you in the right direction. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. So, if any of you have any questions, now would be the time to ask those questions. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out an email with the recording to this presentation, as well as the presentation slides. So I'll just pause there and see if we have any questions. I see here, does the pay equity law affect contingent workers in technical roles, especially those who are W-2 contract workers through approved vendor contract companies? So I'll have to follow up with you on that question. But I can send a resource with all the information for SB 1162. We published a blog post that might answer that question. So sorry, I don't have an answer off the top of my head, but I will send out that link of that blog in the follow-up email. Okay, I see your email here. Yeah, thank you. Cool, just take a second, see if there's any more. Cool, I'm not seeing anymore, and that's totally okay. I want to thank everyone for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join a growing movement. Like I said, if you have any questions afterward as well, something you think of later, or if you want to chat one-on-one, respond to that email. I'm more than happy to point you in the right direction, share resources with you. So yeah, I want to thank everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope that, it's not the last, time we get to talk to each other. I hope we see you at a future event or a future volunteer opportunity. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.